You hear me? We can't.
Now you can hear me. Okay.
Yes, now we can hear you.
Welcome to the webinar sponsored by the Miriam Project Geula Hour with Yehuda Shamrock. And I'm Josh Wander from bringthemhome.org.il in Israel 365. We are very happy again to have Rabbi Pinchas Winston with us today from 36.org. And I will just pass it right over to him, Rabbi Winston.
Thank you very much. Okay, this is the third session we've called Kabbalah 101, and more or less wrap it up today, not because of a shortage of material. That's for sure not. It's like this goes on forever and on and on. There's so many details, but the basic ideas have been given over, and we'll bring some of those more those ideas as well, and use them as a transition to next week, B'ezras Hashem, in preparation for Purim, because now we're already, it's like 2 weeks after Tu B'Shvat, which means 2 weeks before Purim. This week is Rosh Chodesh Adar already. This is Parsha Shkalim, so we're in Purim mode as of this Shabbos, God willing. And you'll see that the angle that we're going to take over here is that once we understand the system and the system works, so then we can help to understand what Mordechai was doing, what the whole story was about, what Hashem was doing, how Geula works. Not just look at the story as people tend to do year after year and just recount the miracles of what Hashem did for us, and that's all. You have to do that. That's fantastic. But we're more interested in the dynamic of Geula, what we can do to expedite or be a part of it. At least that's the main thing. And to understand and explain, how to recognize what's going on, because that's really crucial, important. As I mentioned before in the past many times, one of the questions that always has been driving me is that why it is that the Jewish people tend to get stuck and then live in exile. Why we always seem to be the last to know or recognize that what's happening is in fact the redemption, and prepare for an advance, and get caught and pay the price for getting caught in the end. And one of the reasons why is because I just saw that this evening, in fact, in the lesson that brings it down, that it takes time to sell a house. It takes time to move. It takes time to wrap things up. And now more so than ever. In the past, that it was easier because there were all the banks and papers and things like that. It was a whole different world. But today, everything is very, legal, and there's banks involved, and lawyers involved, and governments involved, and counties involved, and buyers and sellers involved. There's a lot going on to have to be able to move. Anybody who's made Aliyah over the last 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years will tell you that there's a lot involved. And as a result of that, they started the process early enough. And because they did start the process early enough, they could do it all and make Aliyah more or less on their own terms and sell their house, because it's very hard to sell your house, and certainly at top dollar when you're on the run, when you have to get out. That's usually when things go the cheapest, or for nothing at all. The story of a Jew in Hamburg who realized around 1938 that the situation was becoming absolutely horrible and dangerous, and didn't wait to find it anymore, but rather the first day Chomet after Yantiv, he packed his family up. He was a very wealthy broker in Hamburg, Germany, and he just walked away from everything because there was no time. They took what they could take in terms of valuables, but without arousing suspicion. But he had to basically leave his empire behind. He survived the war. Others who did not leave their empires behind are much short of that, but they got stuck and they died unfortunately in the war. But if you want to do it on your own terms, you have to take the time to do that. And people often, I'll do it when I see that there's signs, right? Signs that God is in fact bringing the redemption. What he did, God's going to send you a memo saying, "Okay, you got 2 years. Go ahead, start the selling process. Find a buyer. Go to the bank." It doesn't work that way. In fact, what as Erosion brings down in Mitzrayim, it was a shocker. They had no idea they were going out that month. They were going out because they said it's not possible to go out because there's only 2 ways to go out. One, either we assemble an army that can fight against the Egyptians and defeat them. And we don't have that. We're slaves. We don't have weapons and things like that. We're broken people. We can't fight them militarily. Or huge miracles have to happen, like the 10 plagues, to free us. And we're not worthy of that because we're also involved in idol worship and all these terrible averas that God doesn't like. And then Moshe Rabbeinu says to to the Jewish people. Yeah, but it brings a passage from Shir Shirim about God skipping over mountains and said that when God wants the geula, he wants it to happen because history, as he has designed it, demands it. So then it happens, and he overlooks all the terrible things that we're doing. Every last detail, but a lot of them, and enough that the great miracles could happen for us anyhow. And then before we know, we're rushing out. So, people wait for the signs. Not good advice, because more than likely, as God says to the prophet Yeshaya, we say this in the Haftorah on Mincha, on fast days, that God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. My way of thinking is not your way of thinking. So don't try to understand and put in a certain perspective what I'm thinking based upon what you're thinking, because they're not the same thing. So you have to understand the dynamics to be able to appreciate what God's doing and when he's doing it. Because the truth is, we have the signs. We've been getting signs the entire way through. The signs have been lasting decades already. But the trouble is, people don't recognize them as signs. That's really the problem, because it's like they want a big, huge Hollywood, type banner that says, "Folks, the geula is here, this year, this month. Pack up, we're going out." It's not going to be that obvious because of bechira, because of other factors involved. But if a person understands the process, how things work in creation from the beginning, from the top down, then it becomes a little bit easier, and sometimes a lot easier, to interpret history, to see those signs, to understand, God's dialogue, and to respond to it as he wants us to. So up until now, we've discussed basically two major concepts. Number one is the fact that the Or Ein Sof was subject to something called Tzimtzum, which means constriction. God performed this most miraculous thing that we take completely for granted, because we're inside the system. We've been living for a long time inside the system, and we have no appreciation of the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light of God. If we did, then it would be the other way around. We've been going, scratching our heads going, wow, how is it possible? How did God constrict his infinite light to make it finite? That Tzimtzum is the beginning of everything. Without that Tzimtzum, nothing exists but the light of God. That's it. Once the Tzimtzum exists, so then you can have what's called the halal. The halal means like a hollow thing, because God pulled back his light in the shape of a ball, big ball, because, as Kabbalists explained, because points are equidistant all around the circle, and there's a certain perfection in a circle versus a square where the corners are further away than the sides, etc., etc. But it was in a ball, and it was only held in its place. I'm going to say in space, but it's not really space. In its place by the will of God. There's no skin. There's no concrete wall. There's nothing holding the halal in place and maintaining the integrity of the halal except the will of God. God's at the same time simultaneously willing the halal to exist and the light not to come in, so that we can have this halal. And that was the beginning of everything, because once you had the halal, man could exist. Free will can exist. Evil can exist. There's measurement. There's direction. You can go up, go down, go left, go right, and earn reward in the world to come, and get punished for the averas. All these things, they're all measurement things. They're all measurements. Everything in our lives involved measurements. But those measurements were completely abstract concepts until God made the halal. And was mitzamsim his light. He constricted the light. That's more or less where we have gotten until this point in time. So you've got the Or Ein Sof, diagram is much better, but everywhere you have this halal in the middle of it, so to speak, in the middle of infinity, and it's empty. And there's no life, there's no man, there's no creation, there's no earth, no universe, none of that stuff doesn't exist yet. The Big Bang, down the road, right? It doesn't. It's not anything per se. There is what Kabbalah calls Erosion, a certain amount of Or Ein Sof that was left behind by the light when it went out, because that light's necessary to combine with the new light coming in to be able to make all the creation. But it's a longer Kabbalistic story. But this idea of Erosion is a very, very important concept that goes all through life, and in Kabbalah for sure. Like, for example, if a person, let's say, is davening, obviously it's not the best thing to daven in a bus station or an airport, especially by yourself. It's better to daven in a shul, but it happens. You're traveling, you're going someplace, you run out of time. And there's Eretz Israel, and not so much probably in America, but Canada or England is at that. But in Eretz Israel, it's very common, as the sun setting, to find people pulled over to the side of the road, davening mincha before the sun sets, because they realize they're not going to get back in time. So they're davening, and then they back in their car and they move, right? And what about the place that they stood? Is there anything left over? Anything left behind? So the idea of Erosion is an impression, a residual amount of light. This person davened, that itself draws light down. If the person had kavana, which is a little bit hard to do on the side of a highway, the car zoom, 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 but let's say you had kavana, okay, and you're drawing even more light down. Even after you leave, the light that you drew down into the world, it leaves behind some type of an impression. Not all the light, but some of the light can remain behind. So somebody can be walking through, let's say, for example, the central bus station in Jerusalem, where someone happened to have davened mincha at a corner somewhere, and they walk through that, and all of a sudden, they might not notice it at first, but they might get a little bit of that light, and it might have an impact on them. And that impact might, down the road, cause them to go to a class or go to to some simcha and meet somebody and get to a conversation, and one, they become Torah observant. It's happened before. It's happened again. But that's the idea of Erosion leaves an impression behind. Just like, for example, people leave impressions. Russian Parshas Vayetze talks about the impression that Yaakov left behind when he left town to go to Padan Aram and make his family. And this starts all the way at the top with what's called the Roshim. It's a Rishima. It's an impression, a light that was left behind. But as I said before, it's a much longer, more complicated story. The main thing is that light has to come back in, because it's to make the halal is a major step. I mean, it's an indispensable major step. But if new light does not come back in as well in a measured amount, then you can't have creation. So all you left was the halal. There's absolutely no purpose in that. So therefore, we have another concept called the kav or ein sof. This is when it's like, imagine a ball with a hole, like when you blow the ball up, there's a little pinhole. Put the pin in, you pump the ball up, through the hole there, the air goes in. So likewise, God allowed some of the or ein sof to come back in, but not like all at once from all the sides. So that would obliterate the halal. So instead, what God did, his perfect creating abilities, he caused the light to come back in through a hole at the top, so to speak, into the halal. And this light is what God is going to use to construct everything. Now, there's a lot of steps in between. And for those who are really interested and fascinated in those steps, you can see them in the Arizal. You can, he writes about them extensively, other Kabbalistic works, and hopefully soon to be, God willing, volume 2 of my translation of some lesson material that goes into the whole idea of this Shiras HaKelim and the breaking of the vessels, etc., based on the lesson. But the main thing here at this point in time for our discussion and for the future discussions is the idea of what we call spheres. The word, sphere, I never really checked it up, but I imagine the English word sphere, which means like a ball, probably comes from the word, spheres. Like a lot of English words have Hebrew origins. There's actually a book called the Hebrew Origin of the English Language. You'd be surprised how many words. I mean, one of the best is fruit. Right, you think of fruit and you think of Paris. Like you look at the Hebrew word Paris is fruit, but if you look at the word Paris in the Torah, for example, there's no vowels. So pei resh vav tav, and if you didn't know how to pronounce it properly or you didn't care, you just read it fruit. Too much of a coincidence. Paradise, paradox, words like that. Pardes is like paradise, and paraduma was this kind of like paradox. There's lots and lots of examples, some that are famous and some that are not so famous. But sphere, sounds like it came from the word sphere because they're round, but they're not physical. That's important. All the spheres, and there's 10 general ones, but those 10 have their own 10, and the 10 of the 10 have 10, and they have 10 ad infinitum. There's a sphere for every moment of history, every moment of 6,000 years of history, at least from the spheres of Chesed through Yesod that correspond to our history. Why the sphere is so important? Another name for spheres are called midos, which means measurements, but also attributes. right? A person's midos are their character traits, their attributes. You work on your midos. It's a common expression in Yeshivish language. I'm working on my midos, meaning that I'm trying to improve myself spiritually. But the reason why they're called midos is because basically each sphere is a specifically measured amount of God's light that reflects a certain aspect or facet of his will. In other words, the spheres are the mechanism that God created to take his light, which is his ratzon, his will, his master plan for creation, and to implement it. At the same time, allowing for free will. Because if God's light comes in full blast, as it will in the Messianic era, and it did at Har Sinai, then there's no room for free will because it's the most, does God exist? I'm not sure. Right there. It's like on that day, God will be one and his name will be one because everybody's going to see it without a shadow of a doubt whatsoever. No free will anymore at a point like that. So in order to maintain creation in such a way that the light of God can come into creation, can build everything, and our galaxy is just one of many, and the entire universe is a pinhead on top of a pin, compared to the spiritual worlds above it, which are Yetzirah and Bria and Atzilus and Adam Kadmon, and all the subsets that they have, etc., that in order to do that, the spheres have all this light, and each one is higher than the other. So what's going on, basically, each sphere is acting like a filter. It's receiving a certain amount of divine light, holding some back, and letting some go through. And whatever goes through is less than what was what originally came through the first sphere. So Kesser, which means crown, because it sits on the top of the entire system, has the most amount of light because it's the first one to receive the divine light inside the Halal. It filters the light, and that results in a sphere called Chachma, which means wisdom, and more like abstract knowledge. That's what the light is. The light is just knowledge. Knowledge, light's all the same thing. So it's abstract, meaning that it's the beginning of getting to know God and knowing things, but it's still so abstract that we can't yet relate to it to be able to use it. And then that chachma will filter the light, and that becomes bina, which means understanding, because now since the light is filtered, it's a very important concept in Kabbalah. Normally we talk about how if you want to reveal something, it means that to show it. The more of the thing you show, the more you're going to reveal. So people, companies have big reveals where they might advertise something, just a small part of it, promising to show you the whole thing at the end. So normally in the physical world, the more you reveal, the more can be seen. But in the spiritual world, it's actually the opposite. The more God reveals his light, the more difficult it is for us to relate to it, to see it. Because we're limited. If it's too brilliant, this is what God says to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe says to God on Mount Sinai, show me your way, show me your glory. I want to understand you on the highest levels possible. And God says, no man can see my face, because no man can see my face and live, not physically. You're not capable of having such a revelation. So the light has to be filtered. So what does God do? He puts him in the cleft of the rock, coming up in Parshas Kisisa after the golden calf, and he passes by, and Moshe sees the back of God's head, which he sees the back of the tefillin. Tons of symbolism. No real physical, huge, monstrous tefillin, right? Because there's no sofa can make tefillin that big, and it's all spiritual, because every physical thing is just a physical manifestation of a spiritual concept. So if you go high enough up, you just deal with the spiritual concept and not with the actual physical reality. It's only physical down here. Down here, tefillin are black straps and boxes. But when Yaakov took the stick and put it into the ground to multiply the sheep, the Zohar says, he was being Mekayim, the mitzvah tefillin. He was fulfilling the mitzvah tefillin because he understood what tefillin meant and how it affects the worlds above and how to use that light to accomplish a very important holy purpose. And that's what Kabbalah supposedly is supposed to do as well. So basically, Bina means that light has been more light's been held back. More of the light, more of the extreme aspect of the light, spiritual sublime parts have been held back. And because it's been held back, we can now relate to that light as knowledge that makes sense to us. So therefore it's called Bina, which means understanding. And then we have a sphere called Das, which is kind of a pseudosphere, but again, this is a discussion to itself. And Das usually means this integrated knowledge. On the level of Das, you not only relate to it, but it becomes part of who you are, to the point that violation of the idea is actually violation of the self as well. There's certain ideas that are so part and parcel of who we are that we can't violate them. If we do, we can't live with ourselves, because we feel ourselves violated in the process. And that's dust. Then you get to chesed, right? And now it's different from the upper three spheres, because the upper three spheres are talking more chachma bina das or keser chachma bina, right? Intellectual levels, right? But chesed is already talking about kindness. These are specific character traits, and they correspond to our 6,000 years of history. The first sphere corresponds to the first 1,000 years, and the last sphere, our millennium. And in between, you have the other spheres, the other 4 spheres that correspond to the 4,000 years in between. And they're midas, because this is a world of action. This is a world of growth. This is a world of accomplishing, of developing midas, so that you can become as godly as possible. God made us, but B'Tselem Elokim, in His image. As Forner says, that's just a potential. You have to now grow into that to become an actual Elohim, not God, because Elohim could be a judge or an angel, but a godly being, like as much as like God as you possibly can, because we're made in the image of God. So therefore, the 6 spheres that correspond to our history are all named for character traits: chesed, kindness, gvura, strength, which is like the idea of Simpson, holding back. Right? There's times in life when you have to just give. That's chesed. It's compared to water, just spreads. You got to help people out. Give tzedakah. There's times when you have to hold back. When giving to a person is the wrong thing to do. Or having rachmanas is the wrong thing to do. You have to hold yourself back. That's gevura. Discipline comes from the trait of gevura. The tiferes means beauty, right? But it's a beauty that seems to not. We see right here, it comes from a balance of both the ches and the gevura. Just like Yaakov is kind of like it's a hybrid of both chesed and gevura in a perfect balance. Likewise, tiferes represents that balance, and as corresponds to Torah. The Torah is really been given to us to be able to achieve this balance. And that balance is where life's at. All the greatest pleasure in life, you're at home with yourself, or as they say, comfortable in your own skin, when you achieve this balance called tiferes, the proper balance, which can shift, right? There's obviously times, especially as a parent, you see this, right? But there's times when you have to have more chesed than gevura, and times you have to have more gevura than chesed. Depends on the situation. But a person who's in balance knows when to adjust and how to adjust. But it's that balance per se that's beautiful, that God finds beautiful and other people find beautiful and we find beautiful. It's a very hard thing to achieve. It's a life work. And we make mistakes. But Torah helps us. It guides us. So Torah is compared to it's called the sphere of Tiferes as well. Moshe Rabbeinu's soul is said to have come from the level of Tiferes as well. Actually started up higher, but that's where it came out to the world. Very high level. Then you have, after that, you have Netzach, which means dominance. For example, to win a war is like, from the word Netzach, or to accomplish something is like Nitzchis is eternity. Then you have Hod, which is glory. Netzach is associated with Moshe Rabbeinu. Chesed is associated with Avram Avinu. Gvura with Yitzchak Avinu. Tiferes with Yaakov Avinu. And therefore you can understand these midos more specifically by understanding who the forefathers were and why they represented these traits. And then you have, of course, you have Netzach, which Moshe Rabbeinu, which is the idea of a permanence and the complete picture and being a dominating figure because you're devoted to the will of God as he was. And then Hod is glory, which is glory is glory. Is glorious. That's what it is. It's associated with Arnakom, because really the glory of man was emphasized and portrayed by the Kahuna, especially the Kohen Gadol. Right, he wore specific clothing, Tiferes, the foot of Tiferes, right, to give honor to his position and to beautify what he was doing in his service of God, to tell us that not just because clothing make the man, but because of the fact that the same way that we use clothing to accentuate our bodies, that we should portray ourselves in this very specific way. Likewise, your body is clothing for your soul, and your body also has to be the chvod tiferes as well. And then you have Yesod. Yesod is both the most obvious and also the trickiest to understand. One of the most important, because Yesod basically is the point in the spheres where the light of God, which is for the most part traveling internally, actually makes its way out into the world. That's one of the reasons why Bris Milah takes place on the Yesod, and you have the Orla, which has to be removed, right? And of course, the Yesod represents mankind's creative capability to be like God, and it's not a coincidence that it's one of the most abused aspects of life, at the same time one of the holiest, because you'll always find that where there's a potential for holiness, there's a potential for just the opposite, to profane something even more. And the Arizal brings down that because it represents the shefa, the blessing, the light, the bounty of Hashem coming into the world. I mean, it's the pasuk says, Sadik Yesod Olam. A tzaddik is the foundation of the world, but it means the Yesod, because they are the conduit through which God allows His light to come in and for the rest of the world. We're living off them. The Gemara says that the whole world lives basically the schus of Rabbi Chanan ben Dosa, and he lives off a barrel of a bushel of carob from week to week, not just because that's his own. He lives to serve Hashem. And his merit, the light that comes in through him is so powerful, it feeds the rest of the world. It's a very hard concept to get your head around, unless you understand how all this, the spheres work. But the Arizal brings down in Shar HaGilgulim, you'll find that the best teachers, at least in Torah, but probably in general, anything, they have a certain natural ability and desire to teach. They have a certain capability to teach. They just like pours over. Someone once asked the Chazon Ish, how do you know when you're ready to teach? And his answer was, when you're kind of like boiling over with the knowledge, you just have to share it with somebody else. Then you know you're ready to teach. If it's just a job, you're not going to be a great teacher. Unfortunately, that's the way it is for a lot of people. But a real good teacher, he's acting as the conduit of God's light to bring into the world. So therefore, he says the best teachers like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Akiva, somewhere their soul comes from a level of Yesod, because you can have many. There's the main Yesod of the 10 spheres, but each of the 10 spheres has their own Yesod. And each of those spheres have their own Yesod. And there's just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So obviously, a soul that comes from the Yesod is going to be a much more powerful soul that comes from a Yesod, all the way down the road. But nonetheless, the Yesod itself will give a person the capacity to be able to share knowledge and to act as a conduit for God's light. That is the highest honor. That was Yosef Atzadik. That's why he's the Mechalkel. He was the one who fed everybody. He wasn't just a stum. He was the one in charge of all the food in Mitzrayim and opened up the grain storehouses to feed people during the famine. That's his job as a Yesod, is to feed people, to take care of people. That's what a Yesod does. It's just natural to them, both in terms of their own inner desire and also in terms of their makeup. They have this attraction to it because of where their soul comes from. So to be or not to be, is basically the sod itself. You can't fake it. I mean, you can act in that capacity to some degree, but you'll find that the people who have this level tend to be the ones who are, the ones who act on behalf of the Jewish people, or the world for that matter, to bring blessing and bounty into the world. And the last one is called Malchus, which means kingdom, and that corresponds to David HaMelech, of course, because he is like the king of David Melech Yisrael Chai B'Kam. He's the king of the Jewish people and the ancestor of Maschiach. And a Malchus is an interesting concept. When a Malchus represents the combination of all the spheres above, it's built with light from all the spheres above it. So in a sense, Malchus is, is Kolel, incorporates all 9 spheres above it. And at the same token, it's what we're building. It's like the world, that was left over. The Malchus was the thing that God left over, more or less, for us to complete. That's our job. That's our free will. We bring the light down. How do we do it? Learn Torah. and we perform mitzvahs. And the more we do this with the more intention, the more mesirus nefesh, self-sacrifice, the more light that we bring down. And as a result of that, the light will come down all the way to the malchus, and then the world starts getting rectified. It starts getting fixed up. The reason why the world looks the way it does today, and I say that meaning that there's so much hefkeris, there's so much wild behavior, licentiousness, atheism, agnosticism, even amongst the from people who believe in God and Torah, and all that, and geula, not quite living up to the standard that perhaps they should be living up to. All of us, because it's a very difficult time period, a lot of very, very, very distracting, and very far from Mount Sinai. So as a result of that, it's very hard to stay true to the Torah. We're doing, on one hand, a pretty good job. On the other hand, there's always room for improvements. And if we don't draw the light down, if we don't complete the sphere of Malchus and give it all its missing components, then basically the world looks like it does today. The good news is going to happen anyhow. Whether we succeed or whether we fail, it's going to happen anyhow. The bad news is, what does that mean? It means basically, quite simply, right? The War of Gog and Magog. What's the War of Gog and Magog for? Well, look in the book of the prophets. They just talk about the war. They don't really mention what it comes to do. It's just that in the end of days, that Gog and Magog will come together against the Jewish people and start a major war. Does that include everybody? Not necessarily, but everyone can be connected to it on some level and still be held responsible, even thousands of miles away. But they will come, and there's actually three altogether. Two supposedly have already occurred, according to the Chafetz Chaim. The first one was World War I, the second one was World War II, and the third one, still waiting for it to complete. More than likely it started, but as to be completed. The Gemara calls the war of Sancherib and Chizkiah as being a war of Gog and Magog. So that may have been the first one, and the second one may have been World War II, because World War I, with all due respect to Chafetz Chaim, I have to understand why he said that. Maybe just because it was a major war with all kind of components. But first of all, Jews fought on both sides of the line, and second of all, it was not a war against the Jewish people per se, and they didn't march up to Yerushalayim like they did in World War II. I mean, Rommel, the Nazi army, the whole idea was to coordinate an attack with the Arabs, and the Arabs would come from their side, and the Germans would come from the south, from Egypt, up into Egypt, and take over and meet in Jerusalem and conquer the country. The Jewish Agency was already flying out its documents and people, because the Germans were already flying sorties over Israel and dropping bombs and making life difficult. While Rav Kahanim was laying the foundation stones for Panovich Yeshiva, saying that, don't worry, we'll be okay. And they were. And of course, the major battle of El Alamein, which was miraculous, and the Germans got pushed back, and they had supply issues and all that. But lost my train of thought. Yeah, the main thing is that we're here to complete the Malchus. We're here to finish off the Malchus, and we do that through our Torah mitzvahs and bring the light of God down. That's what has to happen. It's very similar in Kabbalah to life itself. I mean, the spheres are the basis for our bodies. We have a head with three parts of the brain, right? And we have a right arm, a left arm, and a torso. We have, right leg and left leg, and there's the ground underneath us. These correspond to the spheres, right? So we have the Keser Chachma Bina, which corresponds to the brains. The Chesed is the right arm, whereas the left arm, etc., all the way down through the whole body. So a child is born, already has a brain, right? Even, as it's growing up, the brain's there, functioning, doing wonderful things, quite amazing, quite spectacular, but limited. And part of the problem with the brain is that it still lacks, it doesn't have all the information. It still has to be taught. So we call that katnus, a child who is yet to develop themselves. I mean, sometimes you have some children that they break all the rules. They're born already with a huge amount of knowledge and information. They can excel at what they do, very, very quickly. The Vilna Gaon, they say, was giving shiurim in Gemara to Balabatim at the age of 9, And he would only go to play with his friends because his parents insisted upon it. So he had some kind of childhood. He would say to getting a shear, look at the window. This is what I was told. Look at the window and see children play outside. He'd say to the balabati who's giving a shear to, which is probably some shear. Excuse me, I have to go play with my friends now. And they go to play because that's what he had to do. That's what I was told. But there's not a huge amount of examples of that in history, but several, not just in the Jewish world, also, but in the secular world too. But the idea of katnus is that everything is basically there. The brain's going to grow and develop, obviously, because the person's become bigger. The head becomes bigger, so the brain's going to grow too. It seems like it didn't happen, and not for fast enough or at all, but it did. And it's a question how much the child learns as they're growing up. As part of the parents' responsibility, mostly the teacher's responsibility. The child themselves learn from the world around them. But they develop the brain, and eventually, when they grow up, it's called gadlus. Gadlus is when you're, bar mitzvah. You're called a bar das because you can think for yourself. Hopefully, supposedly, your decisions make a difference. Your person can be punishable for their affairs. They're chayiv, in mitzvahs. The people make a nice big bar mitzvah party and celebrate a bar mitzvah, but really, it's a pachad. You're now officially, a servant of Hashem, and you have to do it right as much as possible. So it's a celebration because we love to do Torah and mitzvahs. But on the other hand, let's not lose the forest of the trees and forget the fact that this is now it's a yoke, right? Yokes are good things, right? The yoke, you want the yoke to be on you, because with that yoke of Shemaim, you can fulfill yourself. It's not for God's good that He puts the yoke on us, but it's for our own good. He puts the yoke on us. So without the yoke, we may think we're free. The Yetzer Hara says, we're all free now. That's the Yetzer Hara, because it doesn't want to accomplish things. It just wants to have a blast. It doesn't give it the will to come. But we are able to grow up physically and spiritually and mentally. And as we do that, we get what's called mochin, brains. There's a technical word. It's a Hebrew word for brains is mochin. Moch is a brain. Mochin is plural. But in Kabbalah, mochin is everything. The whole point of drawing down light into the spheres to change things, to make it better, is giving a certain partsuv, which is a collection of 10 spheres, just like a baby is an independent reality from the parents. It just starts off as a cell and splits and eventually becomes a child and a person of their own, even as a baby, right? Likewise, the spheres could develop into their own reality of 10 spheres too, as they're supposed to. And eventually, that child will become a gadol. Then that child is mitukan. That hopefully by that time you've grown up, you're mature. You still have Yetzer Hara, but you know better. You're working on trying to do the most meaningful thing with your life. That's what we're trying to do. Same thing by the spheres. The reason exile, which we have suffered through for thousands of years, and we're still in exile, even though it's been a very pleasant exile, which could be more dangerous than unpleasant exile, but it's still exile. We're not all back in Eretz Yisrael. Not everybody even wants to go back to Eretz Yisrael. That's an exile mentality. That's a galus mentality. To think you're happier living in the Chutz La'aretz in Eretz Yisrael means something is not adding up. It's not quite correct. That's what the spies did. That's what cost us thousands of years of wandering through history and all the suffering that has come along with it. So when you finally get to a point where you can now exercise your free will and do things in a way that takes into account the Yetzer Hara, but does not fall prey to it. So that way you can just maximize your schar and fix the world. You're drawing down light. Every time you make a moral decision, you do the right thing. As opposed to Nevera, you're drawing down light from the upper spheres down into the head of what's called Zerampi, but it's really the collection of spheres that correspond to our history, and giving the system mochi, brains. It's like giving the child brains, so the child can function as an adult, an accomplishing and a mature adult. That's the whole thing. That's what it's all about. That's what learning Torah and mitzvahs is all about. Mochi, that mochin transform the spheres that run our world and build the malchus from katnus to godlus. That's what Pesach was all about. What Hashem, in order to be able to free the Jewish people from Mitzrayim, and take him out of Mitzrayim. But all the miracles, Kabbalah explains that Hashem artificially, because we didn't do it ourselves, he artificially transformed the system from Katnus to Gadlus. Gadlus is the basis of geula, not just for the spheres, but for us too. Because the idea of being a gadol is being a mature adult. An Adam. Adam is not just it's used generically to mean a person, but ultimately, in the Kabbalistic sense of the term, as the Erosion explains, Adam is the perfect, combination of body and soul in balance that you represent. You like the Son of Elohim that you were created in, and how do you do that? Well, we saw that Mitzrayim, the first plague of blood. The first plague in Mitzrayim was blood, because Adam is made up of the Aleph, which corresponds to the soul, and the word Dam, which is blood. So the Jewish people went down to the 49th level of spiritual impurity in Egypt because of all the living there and being in exile, that we had to get out of it. We had to rebuild the Aleph. All the 10 spheres, all the 10 plagues, which correspond to the 10 spheres, the 10 plagues, which is simply to increase the Aleph, so to speak, until it became, the proper proportion to the Dam. And once it did that, then we became an Adam. And the gematria of Adam, as we've mentioned before in the past, is geula, which means redemption. So on a personal level, you cannot be a free person no matter how free you are physically. There's lots of people walking around who don't have shackles in their hands or their legs, and they can come and go as they please, but they're enslaved to technology, to money, to other people. They just can't break away. They can't be themselves. They can't fulfill themselves because they're constantly being forced to, or being manipulated to do things that they really don't want to do. It's not really in their best interest, but if they don't, they feel a lack and they feel left out, whatever. But that's a slavery. That's a shibud. A person's only really charutz, they're free if they are being an Adam on their own personal level. And that's what the Torah says. That's the Mishnah Pirkei Avos says that the mitzvahs were charus on the luchos. Torah was engraved on the luchos, right? Altikre charus elecherus. The same words, different spelling. One means engraved, one means freedom. Why the play in the words? To tell you that freedom was engraved on the luchos, and people roll their eyes and go, well, "Come on, that's one of the worst marketing and advertising campaigns I ever saw. You're going to convince me that living by Torah and mitzvahs and keeping Shabbos and kashrus and daras mishpachas and that's freedom? You kidding? That's slavery," says the Yetzer Hara, to which a person who says that is enslaved, thinking that they're a master in their own house, only to find out that they're not. When a person is able to live up to Torah mitzvahs and do it properly, that's the path to freedom, because that path it's not enriching God. It's not making God smile more than he otherwise would be smiling. He can smile regardless, because after all, if he wants to, he can make us do the right thing. And sometimes he might, for our own good. But the main thing is that it's all for us. The whole thing's for us. So the 10 spheres that God created, and then the umpteen amount of spheres that come out of the 10 spheres, are the system that God used to do two things basically. One is to send his light into the world in a controlled, measured amount that will not destroy us and not take away free will, at least not yet, so that we can receive his bounty and his blessing and survive and be nourished spiritually, of course, physically. It all comes from the same idea. There's a two-way street. Just like the light has to come down, he also made it that our light can go up, that we can draw light down, but also send it back up by learning Torah and performing mitzvahs. We also send light back up, and that light goes up, and as a result of that, it starts to grow into bigger lights, and when it becomes bigger lights, it comes back then again, and we benefit and make the world a better place. That Bekitzer is the system. There's obviously, like I said, so much more, and you can even go online and get more details. But in general terms, that is the whole system. The reason why it's so important is the question becomes: so then, how do you use the system to control exile and redemption? I don't just mean let it happen, but like actually implement something that you actually do, like take a proactive approach, like the Gra spoke about. That we're supposed to take. That's what the whole idea of Maschiach ben Yosef is: proactivity for the sake of redemption. How do you do? What do you do? And how does it? What's the impact? And Mordechai is one of the most important examples of it all. Who happens to have a connection to Mashiach and Yosef too, right? And he shows us what happens when you take an active role in the redemption process, because he understood how the system worked. He didn't just simply say, let's just throw ourselves into it and see what happens. No. He knew. He understood what's going on. He could read the signs, and therefore he knew how to act. And if we have a focus on that, then we empower ourselves to be a much larger part and recipient of the redemption process. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you again from Yerushalayim and from Beitar. We appreciate all your words of wisdom. And thank you. Come again next week. Next week, we're going to start Purim, you said?
Yes, B'ezras Hashem.
Very good. Okay, looking forward to it. Be well. Everybody have a Shabbat Shalom from Jerusalem.
Bye-bye.